Hello guys, what's up? Welcome back to a Coder's Journey. This is the next episode of this course that we're having about implementing the CQRS pattern using the mediator library instead of a web API project developed using ASP.NET Core with controllers. So this is the 11th episode. I hope you've already watched the previous ones. If that's not the case, please make sure you do that, because what we are going to talk about in this episode is based upon the idea of the previous episode. So if you recall, in the previous episode, we kind of talked about having a command called add employees having a command that returns something. So returns like an integer. We've got this add employees, right? That takes in a list of employees to be added to the data store, and it returns an integer. In this episode, I am going to take this one step further and implement something different. But of course, as I said, it is based on the idea of having commands that return something. So let's move to the notes. This section modifies the add employee command to return a newly created employee object, allowing us to provide a more informative response, including the location header of our response. So if you recall, the add employee command that we developed, I think in episode 3 or 5, doesn't return anything. So basically it only returns, takes in, an employee, and what it does in the handler, add employee handler, it adds this to the data store, and then, it basically, if I go to branch 9, it basically adds that employee to the data store, and then it returns. And then inside of the controller here, right, what we are doing is that we are only adding that employee to the data store, and then we're returning a 205 status code. We want to change this, and we want to take it one step further. So yeah, add employee command. So basically, this is what we are going to do. Inside of our add employee command, we wanted to return an employee. So before, if you take a look at it right now, add employee, it doesn't return anything. It just takes in an employee to be added to the database. But right now we want to change it, right? We want to change this so that it not only takes in an employee to be added to the database, it also wants to return an employee. So basically the employee that just got added to the database, it's going to get returned from the handler of this command. So we change iRequest to iRequest employee, indicating that this command now returns an employee object. Then we need to change the handler. So the handler of this add employee previously, it only had one single type parameter. I'm talking about this interface, by the way. But right now it has two. So not only it has this as the command that it's going to handle, but it also has this as the return value. So this handler is going to return an employee after it has done whatever it is going to do. So then basically, as before, what is happening here is that we have like a dependency on our fake data store, right? And then what is happening is that we are handling this request. But take a look at the difference here. So if I go to add employee handler here, take a look here, what is happening here is that we are adding the employee using the fake data store, and then we are returning, and this method returns a task. But here, if you take a look, now this handler method is supposed to return a task of employees, and it is of course adding that employee to the fake data store, right? But it is returning the employee that it received inside of the request, basically inside of the command. So not only we are going to add that employee to the database, but also we are going to return it. And then when we return it inside of our controller, we can add this object to the location header of our response, the response that we are going to send to our client. And then our client, after an employee has been added, the client can see where that employee is located and how it can get to that employee. So if I, in my project, if I go to episode number 10, right? So this is the updated code of our handle method. We are adding the employee and we are returning this, right? And then we want to update our controller. This is the code for the new add employee, method. This is the code I am talking about. So what is happening here? We are getting our employee from our request body. We are going to, call send on our mediator. We are going to instantiate our command, passing in the employee that we got from our request body. And then whatever that handler returns to us is going to get captured inside of this variable, which is of type employee, because the handler of this new command, of this new add employee command, after it does that processing, after it adds the employee to the database, it is going to return that employee. So basically this employee to return is going to be of type employee. Then we are going to return not a simple 201 status code, but we are going to return a created add route. We are going to name the route that we want, get employee by ID, which is defined above this add employee endpoint. And then we are going to create an anonymous type. So it is going to be an ID. It is going to have ID as the, one property. And then it's going to be populated using the ID of the employee that returned from the handler method. And of course, the thing that we want to return is this employee to return, this object. So basically, created add route is going to call this endpoint, which we already have inside of our controller, is going to call it using this ID, and then it is going to tell it to return this object. So let's move on to our controller. Inside of our controller, this is the updated add employee method. So basically, as I told you, we are returning, right? We are returning something from the handler, and then we are calling created add route, passing in the name of the route, passing in an anonymous object with an ID property, which is populated using the ID of the employee that got returned from the handler. And then we are going to pass in the actual object. And by the way, this get employee by ID, if I'm not mistaken, it is created here. So this get employee by ID, as you can see, is an endpoint that takes in the ID of an employee, and it basically returns this, employee. And it is using a query that we've got here. So because you already know how to create queries and how to create handlers, we didn't talk about this get employee by ID query. But of course, using the code of, using the solution file of this course, which you can find in the description of the video, you can go through the code yourself. It is very similar to the query that we already had, get employees. So we had a query called get employees. Now we have a new query called get employees by ID, and then it has its own handler, which is of course going to use the fake data store to call this method, passing in the ID of the query in question, and then returning the employee, as you can see here, that has that ID assigned to it. So yeah, this is the updated, add employee. Now, inside of this HTTP file, if you take a look, we have this add a new employee. We've got this route API employees, right? And if I take a look at my controller, yes, controller. So this is the HTTP post method inside of this controller. So whenever we post or whenever we send a post request, this endpoint is going to get invoked. So using this request, because it is of type post, we are going to invoke that, endpoint, and we're going to pass in this in the request body, and we're going to receive something. And that something, as I said, is the location header. Let me run the API. So let me first get all of my employees. These are my employees. I've got 3 employees. And if I now send a request, this is the 205 201 created a status code. This is the body of my employee, and location header is set like this. So it is, as I said, like the ID of the new employee, right? And then if you now send a GET request to this endpoint, you will be able to see the details of this new employee, which is going to be this payload, right? So this is one way to kind of improve the command that is responsible for creating a new employee. And yeah, that was it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. And if that's the case, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. We're not done yet. As I said, I think we're gonna have like 17 episodes. So stay tuned till the very end. Thank you for watching, and till later. Bye-bye.